under the vast Montana sky, Thomas Everett stood at the edge of his failing ranch, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold. At 68, with arthritic hands and an empty house, he had little left but memories and debt. The dying dog curled at his feet was just another lost cause, an ancient border collie with cloudy eyes and matted fur that nobody wanted. Like Thomas himself, she was living on borrowed time. But on that crisp autumn morning when she limped determinedly into the foothills, something changed. She wouldn't come when called, only turning to bark once, as if asking Thomas to follow. What could an old, blind dog possibly know that he didn't? Could the hills that had taken so much from him finally be offering something in return? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Thomas Everett had not always been a man of few prospects. 40 years ago, he'd purchased the 500-acre ranch with a heart full of dreams and pockets full of inheritance money from his father. The old man had worked himself to death in a steel mill back east, saving every penny so his only son might live a different kind of life. Thomas had chosen Montana, fallen in love with the sweeping vistas and promised himself he'd never be trapped inside four walls like his father had been. In the small front room of his weathered farmhouse, Thomas eased himself into his chair across from Margaret's empty rocker. The sight of it still hollowed him out, even 3 years after her passing. They'd sit there every evening, planning and dreaming, her voice soft but her spirit fierce. "This land will give back what we put into it," she'd always said. Thomas wondered what she'd think of him now, with the banks circling like vultures. The border collie, he'd started calling her Lucky, though there wasn't much lucky about her, wheezed softly from her blanket by the wood stove. The vet in town had given her weeks at most. Cancer, advanced age, and neglect had all taken their toll. "Just us two old-timers now," Thomas murmured, reaching for the stack of bills on the side table. "Final notice. Past due. Foreclosure warning." The words blurred together, but their meaning was clear enough. After Margaret's long illness drained their savings and the drought years cut their income to nearly nothing, Thomas had 6 months at most before the Bridgeton Bank took everything. He'd met Lucky 3 weeks ago at the county fair. A teenager had her tied to a post with a cardboard sign. "Free dog. Owner died." Thomas had watched all day as people stopped, considered, and moved on. Too old. Too sick. Too much trouble. By evening, as Thomas was leaving, the boy was preparing to take her to the shelter. "They'll just put her down," the kid had said, shrugging. Old Man Winters had her forever, but nobody wants a dying dog. Thomas had recognized the name. Jack Winters, a local eccentric who'd lived up in the hills, always talking about striking it rich someday. He died last month, according to the local paper. "I'll take her," Thomas had said, surprising himself as much as the boy. The vet had confirmed what was obvious. Lucky was 15 if she was a day, with tumors, cataracts, and arthritic joints. "Comfortable last days is all we can offer," she'd said gently. "She's had a long life." Now Lucky raised her gray muzzle, cloudy eyes somehow finding Thomas in the dim room. There was something about those eyes, something that seemed to see more than they should. She'd been oddly restless since arriving at the ranch, particularly at night. Several times, Thomas had found her at the back door, whining to be let out, staring toward the eastern hills. Thomas folded the foreclosure notice and tucked it back into its envelope. Tomorrow he'd go into town, talk to Sheriff Jim Harlan about odd job possibilities. Jim had been offering for years, and Thomas had always refused. Pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. "What do you think, old girl? Should we have called it quits a long time ago?" Lucky thumped her tail once against the floor and sighed deeply, as if carrying the weight of an answer too complex for words. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose shutter that Thomas had been meaning to fix. Another job for tomorrow, in a list that never seemed to get shorter. Thomas levered himself out of his chair with a grunt and moved to stoke the fire. The nights were getting colder. Winter in Montana gave no quarter to the unprepared, and for the first time in decades, Thomas wasn't ready. Wood supplies were low, the roof needed patching, and the ancient furnace was more temperamental than ever. He glanced at Margaret's empty chair, remembering how she'd always said there was treasure in these hills, If only they knew where to look. Old mining country talk. Dreams that had sustained them through hard years. Little did he know how right she'd been all along. Town wasn't much more than a single main street with businesses on either side, but to Thomas, the 12-mile drive felt like crossing a border into foreign territory. These days, he only came when absolutely necessary. Miller's General Store sat at the center of Bridgeton, a 2-story building that had served the community for 3 generations. Thomas parked his rusted pickup across the street, gathering his courage before entering. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped inside. Thomas Everett, as I live and breathe. Diane Miller looked up from her inventory sheets, pushing her reading glasses to the top of her head. At 62, she had the energy of someone decades younger. Wasn't expecting to see you until the first snow drove you down from that mountain. Need a few things, Thomas said, nodding toward the small stack of envelopes in her hand. And I expect you've been holding my mail. Just the usual, she said, her expression softening as she handed them over. More bills. Always more bills. How's that old dog settling in? She's hanging on. Thomas moved toward the feed section, calculating what he could afford. Got any damaged bags you're selling cheap? Diane followed him. Thomas, I've told you before. No charity, he interrupted. I pay my way. She sighed. Fine. There's a torn bag of dog food in the back. Half price. I'll take it. As Thomas gathered a few other necessities, the bell rang again. Sheriff Jim Harlan ducked his tall frame through the doorway, his uniform pressed but his face tired. Thought that was your truck, Jim said, approaching Thomas with an outstretched hand. They'd been friends since high school, before Jim left for Vietnam and Thomas stayed to work the land. Been a while. Been busy, Thomas replied, though they both knew that wasn't true. Got a minute? Coffee at Darlene's? Jim gestured toward the diner across the street. 20 minutes. Later, they sat in a booth by the window, 2 mugs of black coffee between them. Thomas turned his bill pile face down on the table. Clayton's been asking about you, Jim said finally, mentioning the bank manager. Says you haven't returned his calls. Nothing to talk about. He wants my land, I'm not selling. Jim leaned forward. Thomas, I know it's not my business. You're right about that. But there are worse things than selling. You could get a place in town, maybe that cottage on Pine Street. Margaret always liked that one. Thomas felt heat rise in his chest. Margaret loved our ranch. She's buried there, Jim. I'm not leaving her alone on that hillside. Jim raised his hands in surrender. Just saying there are options. Speaking of options, Thomas said, changing the subject, you mentioned odd jobs last time. The sheriff smiled. Mrs. Peterson needs her porch rebuilt before winter. I told her you're the best carpenter in the county. Not sure my hands are what they used to be. Neither is her porch. You'll make a perfect pair. As they finished their coffee, Thomas noticed Clayton Reynolds himself entering the diner. The bank manager spotted them immediately, his thin face arranging itself into what passed for a smile. Mr. Everett. Just the man I've been trying to reach. Clayton slid uninvited into the booth beside Jim. I have wonderful news. Thomas doubted that very much. Western Mining Corporation is interested in properties in your area. They're paying well above market value. Clayton slid a business card across the table. Their representative, Mr. Reed, would like to speak with you. This could solve all your financial concerns. Thomas pocketed the card without looking at it. My place isn't for sale. Mr. Everett, Clayton's voice dropped to a whisper, foreclosure proceedings have already begun. This is an opportunity to walk away with something rather than nothing. Jim cleared his throat uncomfortably. Thomas stood, gathering his mail. I'll take my chances, he said, dropping a few dollars on the table for the coffee. And I'll see about Mrs. Peterson's porch, Jim. Outside, Thomas paused on the sidewalk, his hands shaking slightly. His eyes fell on the collection of unpaid bills. 6 months. Maybe less now. He had 6 months to save 40 years of dreams or lose everything. What he didn't know yet was that the solution was already waiting for him, led by an old dog who knew more than anyone suspected. Thomas returned home with a torn bag of dog food and a heaviness in his chest that had nothing to do with his aging heart. As he turned onto the dirt road leading to his ranch, he noticed an unfamiliar truck parked at his neighbor Wilson's property. Men in khaki uniforms were placing stakes with bright orange flags along the property line. Thomas slowed his pickup. One of the men waved, walking over as Thomas rolled down his window. "Afternoon," the man said pleasantly. "You live around here?" "Just up the road," Thomas replied cautiously. "What's all this?" "Survey crew for Western Mining. They've purchased the Wilson place." The man gestured toward the stakes. "Just marking the boundaries before equipment arrives next week." Thomas frowned. "Wilson sold? When?" "Closed yesterday, I heard. Mining companies buying up quite a bit around here." The man studied Thomas with new interest. "You're not the Everett place, are you? Just up the East Road?" Thomas didn't answer, just rolled up his window and drove on, his mind racing. Wilson had owned his ranch even longer than Thomas. What could have convinced him to sell? The question bothered him all the way home. Lucky was waiting on the porch, her tail thumping weakly against the wooden boards as Thomas parked. For a dog supposedly at death's door, she'd been showing surprising energy the past few days. "You hungry, old girl?" Thomas asked, carrying the torn bag of food inside. Lucky followed, but instead of heading to her bowl, she went straight to the living room window that faced east toward the hills, whining softly. "What's got into you?" Thomas set the food down and joined her. From this window, he could see the rising slope of the eastern ridge, covered in pine and aspen, their leaves beginning to turn gold with the season. It was the same view he'd looked at for 40 years, but lately, Lucky seemed transfixed by it. After dinner, Thomas found himself digging through an old trunk in the spare bedroom. Margaret had kept everything: photographs, newspaper clippings, maps of the area dating back to when it was first settled. He found what he was looking for at the bottom, a regional survey map from the 1950s, showing property boundaries and topographical features of the entire county. Thomas spread it across the kitchen table, his finger tracing the outline of his land. The eastern section included a good portion of the foothills, rugged terrain that he rarely visited. There were markings on the map he'd never paid much attention to before, old mining claims, most abandoned decades ago when the initial gold rush had played out. One small notation caught his eye: Winter's Folly, marked with a small X deep in the hills on what was now his property. Jack Winters, Lucky's original owner. The coincidence was strange enough to raise the hair on Thomas's neck. Lucky appeared at his side, resting her graying muzzle on his knee, eyes fixed on the map as if she could read it. "What do you know, girl?" Thomas murmured, scratching behind her ears. "What did old Jack Winters tell you?" There had always been stories in Bridgeton about lost gold mines and hidden veins that the original prospectors had missed. Every bar in 3 counties had an old-timer spinning tales about the fortune just waiting to be discovered. Thomas had dismissed them as drunken fantasies, the desperate dreams of men unwilling to accept that the gold rush had ended a century ago. But now, with the mining company buying up land, with Lucky's strange behavior, with Winter's Folly marked on his property, Thomas wondered if he'd been too quick to dismiss the legends. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Thomas was up early, fixing a loose board on the porch when he noticed Lucky wasn't in her usual spot by the door. He called for her, scanning the yard, then the fields beyond. Nothing. Then he saw her, a small, limping figure making her determined way up the eastern slope, moving with more purpose than she'd shown since arriving at the ranch. "Lucky!" Thomas called. "Come back here, girl." The old dog stopped, turned her head, and barked once, a clear, sharp sound that carried across the morning air. Then she continued her steady climb into the hills. Thomas hesitated only a moment before going inside for his hat, a flashlight, and a canteen of water. Whatever was calling Lucky into those hills, he intended to find out what it was. Thomas hadn't ventured this far into the eastern hills in years. His knees protested each upward step, and his breath came in short bursts, visible in the cool morning air. Yet Lucky moved steadily ahead of him, her own limitations seemingly forgotten. "Slow down, girl," Thomas called, pausing to rest against a pine trunk. "Neither of us is built for this anymore." Lucky turned, her cloudy eyes somehow finding him, then continued with dogged determination. Whatever was driving her seemed stronger than age or illness. The terrain grew steeper, transitioning from scattered trees to rocky outcroppings that threatened to turn an ankle with each misstep. Thomas recognized this area from his map. They were nearing the spot marked Winter's Folly. A bitter smile crossed his face. If this was where Jack Winters had spent his time prospecting, the name seemed appropriate. The land here was harsh, unforgiving. Lucky disappeared around a large boulder. When Thomas caught up seconds later, she was gone. Lucky! His voice echoed against the rock face. No answering bark came. Thomas circled the boulder, scanning the ground for tracks, finding none. It was as if the earth had swallowed her. A flutter of panic rose in his chest. Lucky, he called louder, moving along the rock wall. His hand brushed against something unexpected, not the rough stone, but a tangle of vines and brush that seemed to give slightly under his touch. Thomas pushed harder, and the vegetation parted to reveal a narrow crevice in the rock, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through. Inside, darkness waited. Thomas flicked on his flashlight, its beam illuminating a passage that extended deeper into the hillside. Lucky's worn leather collar had caught on a jagged edge of rock just inside the entrance, the tag reflecting his light. "I'm coming, girl," Thomas muttered, working the collar free and tucking it into his pocket. The passage was tight, forcing Thomas to turn sideways in places, his shoulders scraping against the stone walls. The air grew cooler, damper, carrying an earthy scent of soil and minerals. His flashlight beam danced over the rough-hewn walls, revealing streaks of quartz and darker veins of rock. After about 30 feet, the passage widened suddenly into a small chamber. Lucky sat in the center, waiting, her tail thumping against the dirt floor. "There you are," Thomas said, relief flooding through him. "You had me worried, old." The words died in his throat as his flashlight beam moved past Lucky to the chamber wall behind her. A streak of dull yellow metal caught the light, gleaming softly in the darkness. Thomas approached slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs. He ran a trembling finger along the vein embedded in the rock. It was soft enough to leave a faint mark on his skin. Not the fool's gold he'd seen in museum displays, but the real thing. Thomas's flashlight beam darted around the chamber, revealing more veins running through the walls like frozen lightning, some as thick as his thumb. He remembered enough from his younger days working a brief stint in the Montana mines to recognize a significant find when he saw one. "My God," he whispered, his voice barely audible even to his own ears. "Jack Winters found it after all." Lucky whined softly, moving deeper into the chamber where a narrow tunnel continued into darkness. Thomas followed in a daze, his flashlight revealing that the gold veins continued, perhaps growing even richer. The implications crashed over him in waves. This wasn't just a minor deposit. This could be worth millions. Enough to save his ranch many times over. Enough to change everything. With shaking hands, Thomas pulled out his pocket knife and carefully worked a small nugget loose from the wall, holding it in his palm like a star fallen to earth. It was heavier than it looked, warm from the rock despite the cool air of the cave. "This is why you brought me here, isn't it?" Thomas asked, looking at Lucky who sat watching him with what seemed like satisfaction. "This is what Jack Winters found." The old dog's tail thumped once against the ground. Thomas pocketed the nugget and several smaller samples, his mind racing. He needed to proceed carefully. If word got out before he properly secured his claim, he could lose everything. The mining company already circling his land would descend like vultures. "Let's head back, girl," he said to Lucky. "We've got planning to do." As they emerged from the hidden crevice back into daylight, Thomas noted the exact location, using landmarks he would remember. The gold had waited this long. It would wait a little longer while he figured out his next steps. Thomas sat at his kitchen table long after midnight, the gold samples spread before him on a white handkerchief. The largest nugget, about the size of a coat button, caught the lamplight and held it, glowing with quiet promise. His hands trembled slightly as he picked it up again, feeling its substantial weight. "What do I do now?" he asked the empty room. Lucky lay curled by the wood stove, sleeping more peacefully than Thomas had seen since her arrival. The journey to and from the cave should have exhausted her failing body, yet she seemed somehow rejuvenated. Her breathing was deeper, more regular. Thomas's mind raced with questions and half-formed plans. He knew enough to understand that finding gold and profiting from it were separated by a maze of legal procedures, permits, and claims. One wrong step could cost him everything. He needed to verify the find was legitimate before anything else. Fool's gold had deceived many an amateur prospector, though Thomas was reasonably certain what he'd found was genuine. Still, confirmation was essential. Then there was the matter of mineral rights. Thomas believed he owned them along with the land, but he needed to be absolutely certain before proceeding. The last thing he wanted was to discover some quirk of property law that would hand his find over to the government or, worse, to the mining company already buying up neighboring land. Finally, there was the practical challenge of extraction. Thomas was no miner, and at 68, he couldn't exactly start digging out a mountainside with a pickaxe. Equipment would be needed, possibly partners, each new person representing another risk of his secret getting out before he was legally protected. One step at a time, he muttered to himself, wrapping the samples back in the handkerchief. Morning found Thomas driving not toward town, but in the opposite direction, to Carson City, 50 miles away. He didn't want anyone in Bridgeton connecting him to gold anytime soon. The assayer's office was a small storefront tucked between a hardware store and a pawn shop. A bell jingled as Thomas entered, reminiscent of Diane's general store back home. "Help you?" The man behind the counter was younger than Thomas expected, maybe in his 40s, with reading glasses perched on his nose and a jeweler's loop hanging from a cord around his neck. "Needs something identified," Thomas said cautiously, placing one of the smaller samples on the counter. The man, his nameplate read, Frank Morris, picked up the sample without much interest, then suddenly gave it his full attention. He reached for his loop, examining the nugget carefully. "Where'd you find this?" he asked, his tone deliberately casual. "Old collection. My father's," Thomas lied. "Been in a box for years. Just curious what it's worth, if anything." Frank studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Give me a few minutes." Thomas waited, heart pounding, as Frank took the sample into a back room. Through a half-open door, he could see equipment he didn't recognize: scales, bottles of chemicals, a small furnace. After what seemed an eternity, Frank returned with the sample and a small slip of paper. "It's gold all right. High grade, minimal impurities." He slid the paper across the counter. "Current market value would put this small sample at about $90. If you have more from the same source, it could be substantial." Thomas kept his expression neutral despite the confirmation sending his pulse racing. "Good to know. My father always claimed it was valuable. I'd be interested in buying the collection if you're selling," Frank offered. "I can offer a fair price, cash transaction." "I'll think about it," Thomas said, pocketing the sample and the assessment slip. "Need to check if my brothers have any claim to it first." Back in his truck, Thomas let out a long, shaky breath. The gold was real. His find was genuine. Now he needed to secure his legal rights to it. At the county records office, Thomas requested the deed to his property, claiming he needed it for refinancing purposes. The clerk, a bored-looking woman who didn't recognize him, pushed the documents across the counter without interest. Thomas scanned the yellowed pages with mounting excitement. There it was in black and white, including all mineral rights thereto appertaining. His land, his minerals, his gold. As he drove home, Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. Not just a fleeting moment of optimism, but solid, tangible hope, as real as the gold nugget in his pocket. Lucky was waiting on the porch when he returned, her tail wagging with more vigor than seemed possible for a dog the vet had given weeks to live. "We did it, girl," Thomas told her, kneeling to scratch behind her ears. "First steps, anyway." The Bridgeton Public Library was housed in a century-old building that had once been the town hall. Thomas hadn't set foot inside for years, but now he found himself hunched over a microfiche reader, scrolling through old newspapers and mining records. "Can I help you find something specific, Mr. Everett?" The librarian, Mrs. Phelps, peered at him over her glasses. Just looking up some family history, Thomas replied, not meeting her eyes. He'd already learned that casual interest raised fewer questions than specific inquiries. Hours of research had taught him several important things. First, filing a mining claim was more complicated than he'd hoped but not impossible. Second, the Western Mining Corporation had been systematically buying properties throughout the county for the past 6 months. And third, most concerning of all, they were using sophisticated geological surveys to target their purchases. Thomas printed several pages of information about filing mining claims and tucked them carefully into his jacket. As he was leaving, a colorful flyer on the community bulletin board caught his eye. Western Mining Corporation, building Bridgeton's future. The flyer boasted about job creation, economic growth, and utilizing modern technology to uncover the resources previous generations missed. Thomas tore the flyer down and folded it into his pocket, his jaw tight. They weren't just buying land randomly, they were hunting for something specific. His next stop was the only mining supply store within 50 miles, a dusty establishment called Rocky Mountain Outfitters. The bell jingled as he entered, and Thomas was relieved to see no other customers inside. The owner, a grizzled man named Pete who looked as old as the mountains themselves, glanced up from his newspaper. "Help you?" "Need some basic equipment," Thomas said. "Small scale. Panning for gold on the weekend?" Pete asked with a smile that suggested he'd heard it all before. "Tourist season's over." "Just a hobby," Thomas said vaguely. Pete shrugged and began pointing out various tools, a modern gold pan, a sluice box, a handheld rock crusher. Thomas selected a few items, careful not to buy too much at once. "You know what you're looking for?" Pete asked as he rang up the purchases. "Getting there," Thomas replied. Pete paused, studying Thomas more carefully. "You're the Everett place, right? East of town?" Thomas nodded cautiously. "Thought so. Had some fellows in here last week asking about that area. Well-dressed types, not your usual prospectors. Asked a lot of questions about the old claims out that way." Thomas's heart skipped. "What did you tell them?" "Not much to tell. Most of those claims played out a century ago." Pete leaned in. "Except old Jack Winters always claimed different. Used to come in here, pay cash for supplies. Secretive type." "You knew Winters?" "Sure. Strange old coot, but he knew mining. Had that border collie with him everywhere." Pete nodded toward Thomas's purchases. "You find something interesting out there?" Thomas forced a casual shrug. "Just keeping busy in retirement." Pete's eyes narrowed slightly, but he finished the transaction without further questions. As Thomas gathered his bags, Pete added, "Word of advice? Whatever you're doing, keep it quiet. Those corporate types don't play fair when there's money in the ground." Thomas nodded his thanks and left, the warning echoing in his mind. Back in his truck, he considered his next moves carefully. He needed more information about Jack Winters and his connection to the cave. When Thomas arrived home, he was alarmed to see fresh tire tracks leading partway up his driveway before turning around. Someone had been on his property while he was gone. Lucky greeted him at the door, but instead of her usual tail wag, she was agitated, pacing and whining. "What's wrong, girl? Someone been here?" Thomas checked the house, finding nothing disturbed, then walked the perimeter of his yard. Near the eastern fence line, he discovered footprints that weren't his own, leading from the road toward the hills before turning back. Someone had been scouting his land, possibly looking toward the area where the cave was hidden. That night, Thomas retrieved a shotgun from the closet and loaded it, placing it by his bed for the first time in decades. Lucky lay at his feet, unusually alert for a dog her age. "Getting complicated, isn't it?" he said to her. As if in response, Lucky rose and moved to the window facing east, where the hills were silhouetted against the night sky. She whined softly, pawing at the glass. "I know, girl. We'll go back soon. But we need to be careful now." Thomas pulled Margaret's old journal from the bookshelf, hoping to find something, anything, that might help him understand what he was dealing with. As he flipped through the pages, a folded newspaper clipping fell out, yellowed with age. The headline caught his eye immediately: "Local miner claims major discovery." The article, dated 20 years earlier, featured a picture of a younger Jack Winters and his border collie, a dog that looked remarkably like Lucky in her prime. Thomas read the article with growing amazement. Winters had claimed to find a significant gold deposit but refused to disclose its location. Most had dismissed him as another dreamer, but the article mentioned his background as a professional geologist before becoming a prospector. He wasn't just some crazy old man, Thomas murmured. He knew exactly what he'd found. Thomas couldn't sleep. Margaret's journal lay open beside him, its pages filled with her neat handwriting. She'd been fascinated by local history, recording stories and legends that most dismissed as tall tales. But now, those stories took on new significance. Winters claims the old-timers missed the richest veins. One entry read, "Says they followed surface deposits but never found the mother lode. Most folks think he's crazy, but he showed me a sample once that made me wonder." Thomas turned the page, his heart racing. Margaret had believed the legends. She'd listened to Jack Winters when others laughed. Another entry, dated nearly 15 years ago, ran into Jack Winters at the general store today. That loyal dog of his never leaves his side. He mentioned something interesting, said the real treasure in these hills isn't just gold, but something more valuable. When I asked what he meant, he just smiled and said some secrets are better left in the ground until the right person comes along. Thomas closed the journal, memories washing over him. He'd met Winters a few times over the years, a solitary figure who kept to himself. Thomas remembered him as an odd but harmless old man who always had that border collie trailing behind him. Could it possibly have been Lucky as a younger dog? The timing seemed right. Dawn found Thomas making preparations. He packed a small backpack with water, food, better flashlights, and some basic tools. If he was going to explore the cave properly, he needed to be prepared. "Ready for another hike?" he asked Lucky, who seemed to understand, her tail wagging with unusual vigor. They set out as the sun cleared the eastern hills, casting long shadows across the valley. Thomas moved with purpose now, following the path they'd taken before. He'd memorized the landmarks, noting a lightning-struck pine and an unusual rock formation that would guide him back to the hidden entrance. The climb was no easier the second time, but Thomas pushed through the discomfort. At 68, his body protested, but determination drove him forward. Lucky moved ahead with surprising energy, occasionally pausing to ensure Thomas was following. At the rock face, Thomas located the concealed crevice more easily, though it remained nearly invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. He made a mental note to devise some way to secure it. The last thing he needed was someone else stumbling upon his discovery. Inside, the cool darkness welcomed them. Thomas's improved flashlights revealed details he'd missed on his first visit. The cave was larger than he'd initially thought, with the main chamber extending back farther than his previous light had reached. The gold veins were even more impressive under proper illumination, weaving through the rock like gilded rivers. Thomas carefully extracted a few more samples, placing them in a small canvas pouch. As he worked, Lucky explored deeper into the cave, disappearing down a narrow tunnel. Thomas followed, having to crouch as the passage constricted. After about 30 feet, it opened into a second chamber, smaller than the first but with an unusual feature. A small pool of water, perfectly clear, fed by some underground source. Lucky was already drinking from it, lapping eagerly. "Careful, girl," Thomas cautioned, though the water looked pristine. He knelt beside the pool, dipping his fingers in. It was cool and had a slightly mineral taste when he touched his fingers to his tongue. Above the pool, more gold veins ran through the rock, some disappearing into the water itself. But Thomas's attention was drawn to something else, marks on the cave wall that didn't look natural. Shining his light directly on them, he realized they were crude letters carved into the stone. JW 1998, The Real Treasure Heals. Jack Winters' initials and a date from 24 years ago. But what did the message mean? The real treasure heals. Thomas looked at Lucky, still drinking from the pool, seeming more energetic with each passing day despite her terminal diagnosis. A wild thought struck him. Could there be something in the water, some mineral property that was affecting Lucky's health? It seemed impossible, yet the evidence was lapping water at his feet. a dying dog that grew stronger each time she visited this cave. Thomas filled a small bottle with water from the pool, tucking it carefully into his pack. He'd have it tested, though he wasn't sure how to explain where it came from. As they made their way back through the tunnel to the main chamber, Thomas noticed something he'd overlooked before: old tools, rusted with age, tucked into a crevice in the wall. A pick, a small shovel, and what looked like a metal detector, all bearing signs of use. "Winter's equipment," Thomas murmured. The old prospector had worked this claim for years in secret, taking only what he needed, keeping the location hidden from the world. But if the gold was as extensive as it appeared, why hadn't Winters cashed in? The message by the pool suggested there was more to this cave than just gold, something Winters had valued even more highly. Thomas gathered his samples and prepared to leave, making careful mental notes about the cave's layout and contents. He needed to secure his claim legally before taking any major steps, but he also needed to understand exactly what he was claiming. The small laboratory in Carson City specialized in water analysis for agricultural purposes. Thomas presented himself as a rancher concerned about his well water, which wasn't entirely untrue. "Basic mineral panel runs $80, the technician told him, accepting the water sample. "Results in 3 days. We can mail them or you can pick them up." "I'll pick them up," Thomas replied, not wanting anything traceable going to his address. 3 days of anxious waiting followed. Thomas spent the time repairing long-neglected fences on the western edge of his property, the opposite direction from the cave. He wanted any observers to think his interests lay elsewhere. Lucky accompanied him, showing remarkable stamina for a dog supposedly in her final days. Her eyes remained cloudy, but her movements were more fluid, her appetite improved. Thomas found himself watching her closely, wondering if he was imagining the changes. On the 3rd day, Thomas returned to Carson City. The lab technician handed him a sealed envelope with a puzzled expression. "Everything okay with your sample?" she said. "But it's unusual. Mind if I ask where this water comes from?" Thomas tensed. "My well." "Why?" "It has an unusual mineral composition. High in certain trace elements we don't often see in groundwater around here." She hesitated. "Actually, we had to run the tests twice to confirm. There's a combination of minerals that's quite rare." Thomas accepted the report with a noncommittal nod. Old well. Goes deep. Back in his truck, he tore open the envelope, scanning the technical document inside. Most of it meant little to him. ppm measurements of various minerals, pH levels, dissolved solids. But at the bottom, a handwritten note caught his eye. Elevated levels of rare earth elements including lanthanum and cerium. Unusual concentration of lithium. Similar profile to certain hot springs known for therapeutic properties. Safe for consumption but unique geological source indicated. Thomas read the note 3 times, his mind racing. Therapeutic properties. The real treasure heals. Lucky's improving condition. It all connected. When Thomas returned home, a black SUV was parked in his driveway. A man in an expensive suit leaned against it, examining Thomas's modest ranch house with the calculating gaze of someone assessing property value. Thomas parked behind the vehicle, blocking it in, and stepped out cautiously. "Can I help you?" The man straightened, offering a practiced smile and an outstretched hand. "Jason Reed, Western Mining Corporation. You must be Thomas Everett." Thomas ignored the hand. "You're trespassing." "My apologies. I stopped by to introduce myself and found no one home." Reed's smile didn't waver. "I left my card with your neighbor Wilson before he sold. I assume Clayton Reynolds mentioned our interest in your property." "He did. I'm not selling." Reed nodded as if Thomas had made a reasonable opening offer in a negotiation. "I understand your attachment to your land, Mr. Everett. Many of the ranchers we've worked with felt the same way initially. But once they understood the value we were offering, well above market rate, they recognized the opportunity." "Good for them," Thomas said flatly. "I'm not interested." Reed's expression shifted subtly, the smile becoming more fixed. "Mr. Everett, I should be direct. We've conducted extensive geological surveys of this region. Your property sits in an area of particular interest to us." Why is that? Thomas asked, even as alarm bells rang in his mind. Let's just say the potential for mineral deposits in this formation is significant. We're prepared to offer you 3 times the market value for your ranch. That's substantially more than your neighbors received. Thomas felt a cold anger building. They knew. Maybe not exactly where the cave was, but their surveys had told them enough to know gold was present. My answer's still no, Thomas said. Now I'd appreciate it if you'd leave. Lucky appeared from around the barn, approaching the stranger with uncharacteristic aggression, a low growl rumbling in her throat. Reed eyed the dog with distaste. Is it under control? She, Thomas corrected, has good instincts about people. I'd listen to her if I were you. Reed retreated a step, then reached into his jacket pocket and produced a business card. Think about our offer, Mr. Everett. At your age, with a property this size, the burden of maintenance alone must be considerable. This is an opportunity for a comfortable retirement. I'll die on this land, Thomas said simply. A flash of irritation crossed Reed's face. Everyone has a price, Mr. Everett. It's just a matter of finding it. He returned to his vehicle. I'll be in touch. As the SUV disappeared down the driveway, Thomas knelt beside Lucky, scratching behind her ears. Good girl, he murmured. You saw right through him, didn't you? Lucky leaned against his leg, her eyes fixed on the road where Reed had vanished. Thomas unfolded the lab report, reading it again. The cave water contained rare minerals with healing properties. Jack Winters had known this, had perhaps experienced the benefits himself. And now Thomas understood what the old prospector meant. The real treasure wasn't the gold, but the water itself. With this realization came a new sense of urgency. If the mining company extracted the gold using modern methods, chemicals, explosives, heavy machinery, they would destroy the healing spring in the process. Thomas wasn't just protecting his financial future now, he was protecting something potentially far more valuable. Thomas spent the next week making preparations. With the mining company's interest confirmed, he couldn't afford to wait any longer. Using cash from his meager savings, he purchased additional supplies from hardware stores in neighboring towns. Nothing that would raise suspicions, just basic tools that could serve multiple purposes. He converted a corner of his barn into a makeshift workshop, away from windows and curious eyes. There, he carefully sorted the gold samples he'd collected, using techniques he'd researched to separate the valuable metal from surrounding rock. The work was painstaking, but there was a rhythm to it that Thomas found almost meditative. As his arthritic hands worked the stone, memories of his father surfaced, how the old man's hands had been permanently stained by industrial chemicals, his fingers gnarled from decades of manual labor. You were right to want something different for me, Dad, Thomas murmured to the empty barn. But you never said it would be easy. By the end of the week, Thomas had accumulated a small but significant quantity of gold, enough to make a critical difference in his immediate financial situation. The question was how to convert it to cash without drawing attention. The answer came in the form of an advertisement in a Carson City newspaper: gold and silver purchased, no questions asked, fair market value. The pawn shop was small and dingy, its windows covered with iron bars. The owner, a heavy-set man with suspicious eyes, examined Thomas's offerings without comment. 2,800, he finally said, pushing a calculator across the counter to show his calculations based on weight and purity. It was less than the gold was worth, but Thomas had expected that. The important thing was the cash in hand, with no paper trail. He accepted the money and left, feeling the unfamiliar weight of the bills in his pocket. His next stop was the bank in Bridgeton. Clayton Reynolds couldn't hide his surprise when Thomas asked to make a payment on his outstanding loan. This is unexpected, Clayton said, eyeing the cash Thomas placed on his desk. I thought perhaps you'd reconsidered the offer from Western Mining. Just a good month, Thomas replied vaguely. Sold some equipment I wasn't using. Clayton's eyes narrowed, but he processed the payment, reducing Thomas's immediate debt by a meaningful amount. This buys you some time, but the full balance is still due by the end of the year. I'm aware of the terms, Thomas said, tucking the receipt into his shirt pocket. As he left the bank, Thomas spotted Reed's black SUV parked across the street. The mining company representative was watching him, making no effort to conceal his interest. Thomas nodded stiffly in acknowledgement and continued to his truck. The encounter reinforced what Thomas already knew. He was being monitored. Reed suspected something but didn't know exactly what. Thomas needed to secure his claim legally before the company found the cave. Back at the ranch, Thomas unpacked the remaining supplies he'd purchased, a set of old mining equipment from an antique store. The rusted pick, shovel, and pan were similar to the tools he'd found in the cave but in better condition. He'd paid too much for them, but they were exactly what he needed. Lucky watched from the barn door as Thomas cleaned and restored the tools, her head tilted in curiosity. Insurance, Thomas explained to her. If anyone asks why I'm interested in mining equipment, I've got a story about restoring my grandfather's old tools. People will believe an old man with a harmless hobby. Thomas worked late into the evening, oiling the tools and mounting them on the barn wall in a display that looked more decorative than functional. When he finished, he stepped back to admire his work. To casual observers, it would appear to be nothing more than nostalgic memorabilia. As darkness fell, Thomas made one final preparation. Using the topographical map from Margaret's collection, he marked the exact location of the cave entrance and several false locations as well. Then he photographed the map and stored the memory card in a waterproof container buried beneath a fence post. If anything happened to him, Sheriff Harlan would know where to look. Paranoid, aren't I? Thomas said to Lucky as they returned to the house. But the dog's alertness, her constant attention to the road and the property boundaries, suggested his caution was warranted. Twice that day, unfamiliar vehicles had driven slowly past the ranch. Thomas had the distinct feeling of being watched. That night, Thomas made a decision. It was time to formally file his mining claim. The process would create a public record, which carried its own risks, but the legal protection was worth it. Without official recognition of his rights, he remained vulnerable to the mining company's resources and influence. As if sensing his resolution, Lucky came to sit beside his chair, resting her head on his knee. Thomas scratched behind her ears, noting the improved texture of her coat, the brightness in her cloudy eyes. "We're in this together now, aren't we?" he said softly. Lucky's tail thumped against the floor, once, twice, 3 times, a steady rhythm like a heart finding its strength again. The law office of Patricia Sawyer was located in Mountain Creek, a town 40 miles from Bridgeton, far enough that Thomas wasn't likely to run into anyone who knew him. He'd chosen her carefully after researching attorneys specializing in mining claims and property rights. "Mr. Everett," Patricia greeted him, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and no-nonsense demeanor. "What brings you to my office today?" Thomas had prepared his story carefully. "I believe there may be valuable minerals on my property. I want to ensure my rights are protected before exploring further." Patricia nodded, taking notes. "Smart move. Many landowners don't realize they need to formally establish their claims, even on their own property. Do you have evidence of these minerals?" Thomas hesitated, then placed a small gold sample on her desk. Patricia's eyebrows rose slightly, but her professional composure remained intact. "I see. And where exactly is your property located?" "Eastern Bridgeton County. 500 acres, been in my possession for 40 years. Patricia made another note. "Any interest from mining companies in your area?" "Western Mining Corporation has been buying neighboring properties. They've approached me several times." Patricia's pen paused. "Western Mining? That complicates things. They're known for aggressive acquisition tactics and have considerable influence with county officials." She studied Thomas thoughtfully. "Have you filed any paperwork yet? Given any public indication of your discovery?" "No. Wanted to understand my options first." "Good." Patricia leaned forward. "Here's what we need to do. First, we'll file the necessary claim forms with the Bureau of Land Management, establishing your rights to the minerals. Second, we'll create a trust to hold the claim, with you as the beneficiary but not the named owner. This provides a layer of protection and privacy." "Is that legal?" Thomas asked. "Completely. It's a standard approach for protecting valuable assets." Patricia began drafting documents. "The key is timing. We want your claim properly recorded before Western Mining realizes what you found, but we also want to minimize public attention. For the next 2 hours, Thomas worked with Patricia to complete the necessary paperwork. The mining claim documents required specific details about the location and nature of the minerals, which Thomas provided carefully, focusing on the gold and omitting any mention of the water's unique properties. We'll file these with the BLM office tomorrow, Patricia said, organizing the completed forms. I suggest we delay recording the claim with the county for 30 days. That's perfectly legal and buys us time before the information becomes locally accessible. Thomas agreed, relief washing over him. The claim would be official but wouldn't immediately appear in county records where Western Mining might be watching. One more thing, Patricia added. Have you considered selling mineral rights rather than the property itself? You could maintain ownership of the land while allowing controlled extraction. Thomas shook his head firmly. The land stays intact. Patricia studied him. There's more to this than just gold, isn't there? Thomas met her gaze steadily but said nothing. Fair enough, she conceded. Client confidentiality means I don't need to know everything. But whatever you're protecting, make sure you have proper documentation. In these cases, evidence is everything. On the drive home, Thomas felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The legal groundwork was laid. His claim would be protected under federal law. Now he needed to gather more evidence about the water's properties to strengthen his position if challenged. As he turned onto the road leading to his ranch, Thomas noticed a county sheriff's vehicle parked near his gate. Not Jim Harlan's, but Deputy Mercer's, a younger officer Thomas didn't know well. The deputy waved him down. Afternoon, Mr. Everett. Just doing a routine patrol. Noticed some unusual activity reported in the area, unknown vehicles, possible trespassers. Anything strange happen out your way? Thomas considered his response carefully. Saw a black SUV drive by a few times. Western Mining fellow. Reed, I think his name was. Deputy Mercer nodded, making a note. They've been busy around here. Anything else? Thomas thought of the tire tracks he'd found near his eastern boundary. Nothing specific, but I'd appreciate extra patrols if you're offering. No problem. Sheriff Harlan asked us to keep an eye on the outlying properties. Mercer hesitated. Between us, sir, some of these mining company contractors don't much care about property lines. Might want to keep your gates locked. Appreciate the warning, Thomas said. After the deputy left, Thomas drove slowly to the house, scanning his property with new awareness. In the yard, Lucky greeted him with unusual alertness, her ears perked forward, eyes tracking movement along the distant tree line. Thomas followed her gaze and caught a brief flash of light among the trees, sunlight reflecting off glass or metal. Binoculars, perhaps. Or a camera lens. Inside, girl, Thomas said quietly, ushering Lucky toward the house. We've got company. That evening, Thomas kept the lights off in the front rooms, moving around the darkened house with practiced familiarity. Through a side window, he observed a vehicle parked on the county road, just visible in the fading light. Thomas picked up the phone and dialed Jim Harlan's direct line. Jim? Thomas Everett. Think you could pay me a visit tomorrow? Got something I need to discuss. He paused. And Jim? Come alone if you don't mind. The time for complete secrecy had passed. Thomas needed an ally, someone with authority he could trust. If Western Mining was willing to conduct surveillance on his property, they were growing desperate, and desperate corporations took desperate measures. Sheriff Jim Harlan arrived just after sunrise, his patrol vehicle raising dust on the long driveway. Thomas watched from the porch, coffee mug in hand, Lucky alert at his side. Early bird, Thomas commented as Jim stepped out of the car. Figure whatever's got you making phone calls after years of stubborn silence must be important. Jim accepted the offered mug of coffee. So what's this about, Thomas? Not like you to ask for help. Thomas led Jim around to the back porch where they could speak privately. What do you know about Western Mining? Jim's expression hardened. Corporate outfit, heavy political connections. Been buying up land all over the county. Why? They're watching my place. Had a fellow named Reed make an offer, then spotted surveillance after I turned him down. Jim nodded. Jason Reed. Smooth talker, but there've been complaints. Nothing I could make stick. He studied Thomas. What's he want with your land specifically? You're not exactly sitting on prime real estate. Thomas hesitated, then made a decision. Need to show you something, but I need your word it stays between us. You in some kind of trouble, Thomas? Not yet. But I might be. Jim set down his coffee cup. You've got my word. Thomas led Jim to the barn and unlocked a new padlock on an old trunk. Inside, carefully wrapped in cloth, were several gold samples. Jim's eyes widened. Found it on my property, Thomas said simply. Eastern Hills. There's more. Jim let out a low whistle. And Western Mining somehow knows. They've done surveys. They suspect, but they don't know exactly where. Thomas explained about filing the claim, the trust, the delayed recording. Need time to secure everything legally before they find out details. Jim handed the samples back. Smart moves but risky. These corporations play hardball, Thomas. What do you need from me? Official eyes. If anything happens, property damage, threats, I need someone who knows the real story. Jim nodded slowly. I can keep patrols regular, make it clear you've got friends in official places. He hesitated. But Thomas, be careful. Gold makes people crazy. Always has. After Jim left, Thomas felt both relieved and uneasy. Sharing his secret had been necessary but dangerous. He trusted Jim, but every person who knew increased the risk of exposure. Thomas spent the morning securing his property, checking fences, installing simple alarms of fishing line and tin cans at key access points. Low-tech but effective for alerting him to trespassers. In the afternoon, he made another trip to the cave, bringing water containers to collect more of the spring water. Lucky accompanied him, growing visibly more energetic as they approached the hidden entrance. Inside, Thomas worked efficiently, filling containers and taking additional gold samples. He also set up a simple trail camera near the concealed entrance, not visible from outside, but positioned to capture anyone who found the crevice. As Thomas worked, Lucky explored the back chamber, drinking from the mineral pool. Thomas had been bringing her daily doses of the water, and the change in her condition was remarkable. Her coat had regained luster, her movement was more fluid, and she ate with enthusiasm. The vet would be baffled by her improvement. They returned home as dusk approached. Thomas was securing the barn when he spotted a vehicle turning into his driveway, the now familiar black SUV. Lucky growled low in her throat as Jason Reed stepped out, accompanied by another man carrying what looked like scientific equipment. Mr. Everett, Reed called, his false friendliness strained. Hope you don't mind us stopping by. This is Dr. Collins, our chief geologist. We're conducting some routine surveys in the area. Thomas approached slowly, positioning himself between the visitors and the path to the eastern hills. This is private property, Mr. Reed. You didn't call ahead. Just a quick visit. Won't take much of your time. Reed's smile didn't reach his eyes. Dr. Collins has some questions about the topography of your eastern acreage. Not interested in answering questions. Please leave. The geologist stepped forward, undeterred. Mr. Everett, our preliminary surveys indicate significant mineral deposits in this formation. With your permission, we'd like to take some soil samples from. No permission granted, Thomas interrupted. And no samples. Now both of you, off my land. Reed's facade of friendliness slipped. Mr. Everett, we're prepared to significantly increase our offer. Whatever you think you've found, we can help you extract its full value. The statement confirmed Thomas's suspicions. They knew something was there but not exactly what or where. Lucky barked sharply, positioning herself between Thomas and the visitors. Control your dog, Reed said tensely. She is controlled. She just doesn't like trespassers. Thomas stood his ground. Final warning before I call the sheriff. Reed stared at Thomas for a long moment, then nodded to the geologist. We'll be in touch, Mr. Everett. Everyone has a price, or a breaking point. The threat hung in the air as they returned to their vehicle. Thomas watched them drive away, a cold determination settling in his chest. He hadn't imagined the stakes would escalate so quickly. Inside the house, Thomas found an old metal box containing important documents, deed, insurance papers, his will. At the bottom was something he hadn't looked at in years, a sealed envelope from Jack Winters, delivered after the old prospector's death by his attorney. Thomas's hands trembled slightly as he opened the sealed envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the handwriting cramped but legible. To whoever receives this after my passing. If you're reading this, you've either purchased my property or somehow connected to what I found in the Eastern Hills. My attorney was instructed to deliver this only if certain conditions arose after my death. What I discovered isn't just gold, though there's plenty of that. The real treasure is the water. It has healing properties unlike anything documented in modern medicine. I've lived 20 years longer than doctors predicted because of it. My loyal companion too. I've kept this secret because I've seen what corporations do to such discoveries. They extract, exploit, and destroy. The right person will protect it, use it wisely. If you're reading this, perhaps that's you. The cave has been my life's blessing. May it serve you well. Jack Winters. Thomas read the letter twice, then set it carefully on the table. Jack Winters had known exactly what he'd found, not just gold, but something potentially far more valuable. And he'd chosen to protect it rather than profit from it. Thomas was still contemplating the letter when headlights swept across his windows. He moved cautiously to look outside, relieved to see Jim Harlan's patrol car pulling up. "Didn't expect you back so soon," Thomas said, opening the door. Jim's expression was grave. "Got some information you need to hear." He stepped inside, nodding to Lucky, who greeted him with a cautious wag. "Reed and his people have been busy. They filed permits for exploratory drilling on all properties adjacent to yours." "They can do that?" "With the landowner's permission, which they have. But here's what concerns me." Jim placed a document on the table, a geological survey map with Thomas's property clearly marked. This was on file with the county planning department. They've been mapping mineral deposits throughout the region. Thomas studied the map. His property showed a bright red area on the eastern section, precisely where the cave was located. "They know something's there," Jim said. "And they're closing in from all sides. My contact at the county says they've been asking about mineral rights, whether they transfer with property sales in our jurisdiction." "They do on my deed," Thomas said, thinking of the papers he'd reviewed. "That's good. But Thomas, these people have resources and connections we can't match. If they want something badly enough, they find ways to get it." Jim tapped the map. "What exactly are we dealing with here? Just gold, or something more?" Thomas hesitated, then handed Jim the letter from Winters. As the sheriff read, his eyebrows rose steadily. "Healing water? You believe this?" "My dog was dying 3 weeks ago," Thomas said simply. "Tumors, blindness, could barely walk. Look at her now." Jim glanced at Lucky, who was indeed moving with the energy of a much younger dog despite her cloudy eyes. "Could be coincidence. I've had the water tested. It contains rare minerals with known therapeutic properties. Nothing magical, just extremely unusual geology." Jim whistled softly. "That would be worth more than gold to the right people." "Or worth destroying to others," Thomas added. "If pharmaceutical companies can't patent natural substances, they'd have no incentive to let it exist," Jim finished. "Damn, Thomas. You've stepped in it this time." They were interrupted by Lucky's sudden alertness, her ears perked toward the window. Seconds later, they heard a vehicle approaching, moving too fast for the dirt road. Jim moved to the window. Black pickup, no lights. Not local. Thomas grabbed his shotgun from beside the door. Back of the house. Now. They moved quickly through the darkened house to the kitchen at the rear. Through the window, they could see flashlight beams sweeping across the eastern field, moving toward the hills. "Trespassers," Jim said grimly, reaching for his radio. "I'll call for backup." "No time," Thomas replied. "They're heading for the cave. If they find it." Jim hesitated, then nodded. "Lead the way." "But Thomas, we do this by the book. I'm still the law here." They slipped out the back door, Lucky following silently. Thomas grabbed a powerful flashlight from the porch, then led them on a roundabout route toward the eastern hills. His knowledge of the terrain gave them an advantage. There was a faster way to the cave than the direct path the trespassers were taking. As they moved through the darkness, Jim spoke quietly. "You realize this is just the beginning? If what Winters wrote is true, this goes beyond one mining company." Thomas nodded grimly. "That's why I need to control how this plays out. The cave can't fall into corporate hands. Too much at stake." The distant flashlight beams were moving more purposefully now, as if following specific coordinates. Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. Somehow, they'd obtained the exact location. "They have inside information," Jim murmured, echoing Thomas's thoughts. "Someone at the county, maybe? Or they bugged my house, my truck." Thomas had considered the possibility but dismissed it as paranoid. Now he wasn't so sure. They reached the ridge above the cave entrance, careful to stay low against the skyline. Below, 3 men were systematically searching the rock face, their movements efficient and practiced. "Professional," Jim observed. "Not just local muscle." Thomas watched with growing dread as one of the men moved directly toward the concealed crevice. They were going to find it. Suddenly, Lucky darted forward, barking fiercely as she charged down the slope toward the intruders. "Lucky, no!" Thomas called, but it was too late. Lucky's barking shattered the nights. Silence. The 3 men below startled, their flashlights swinging wildly before converging on the charging dog. "Damn it," Jim muttered, drawing his service weapon. "Cover's blown." Thomas was already moving, sliding down the slope toward Lucky. "Sheriff's Department," Jim shouted, following close behind. "You're trespassing on private property. Hands where I can see them." 2 of the men immediately raised their hands. The third reached toward his waistband, but froze when Jim's flashlight beam caught him. "Don't," Jim warned, his voice cold with authority. Lucky circled the intruders, barking continuously, her aged body somehow transformed by protective fury. Thomas reached her side, placing a restraining hand on her collar. "Easy, girl," he murmured, though his own heart was racing. Jim approached the men, his weapon steady. "Face down on the ground, hands behind your heads." As the men complied, Thomas recognized one of them, the geologist who had accompanied Reed earlier. The other 2 were strangers, but their equipment was professional grade. GPS devices, sample collection kits, and what looked like ground-penetrating radar. "This is a misunderstanding," the geologist said, his face pressed against the dirt. "We're conducting authorized surveys. At night, without permission, with no identification or vehicles marked with your company logo?" Jim's tone was skeptical as he secured the men with zip ties. "Save it for the judge." Thomas scanned the area with his flashlight, relieved to see they hadn't yet discovered the cave entrance. Lucky had intervened just in time. Jim called for backup on his radio, then turned to Thomas. "They'll be detained for criminal trespass, but Reed will have them out by morning. Corporate lawyers work fast." Thomas nodded grimly. "At least we caught them before they found anything." "This time," Jim agreed. "But they're getting closer. Whatever you're planning, Thomas, you need to accelerate it." As they waited for deputies to arrive, Thomas examined the equipment the men had brought. Among their gear was a printout, detailed scanning results showing subsurface anomalies in the eastern section of his property. One area was circled in red, with coordinates that would have led them directly to the cave. "They've got underground imaging," Thomas said quietly, showing Jim the document. "They know exactly where to look." Jim's expression darkened. "This goes beyond normal exploration. They must know about more than just gold." 2 deputy vehicles arrived within 20 minutes. As the officers took custody of the trespassers, Jim pulled Thomas aside. "I can hold them for 24 hours, maybe 48 if I push it. After that, they'll be back with warrants, permits, whatever legal cover they can manufacture." Jim ran a hand through his graying hair. "You need to document everything now, the cave, the water, the gold. Get it all on record before they find a way to seize control." Thomas agreed. Once the deputies had departed with their prisoners, he made a decision. "I need to show you something," he told Jim. "The full picture, Leading Jim and Lucky to the concealed crevice, Thomas revealed the cave entrance. Inside, Jim's amazement matched Thomas's own first reaction. "My God," the sheriff whispered, his flashlight beam playing over the gold veins. "This is substantial." That's not all. Thomas led him deeper, to the second chamber with the mineral pool. He explained the properties of the water, showing Jim the samples he'd collected and the testing results. Jim knelt by the pool, examining the unusual formation. "So this water, it's really healing your dog?" "See for yourself," Thomas replied. Lucky was cancer-ridden, could barely walk. The vet gave her weeks at most. As if understanding, Lucky approached the pool and drank deeply, her movements belying her advanced age. Jim dipped his fingers in the water, bringing them to his nose to smell the mineral scent. "I've never seen anything like this." Winters found it decades ago. Kept it secret his whole life. Thomas gestured to the carved message on the wall. He understood what would happen if corporations got hold of it. They'd exploit it until it was destroyed, Jim concluded. Standard procedure, maximum extraction, minimum preservation. Thomas nodded. "That's why I can't just sell and walk away. This isn't just about money. It's about something that could help people, something that shouldn't be controlled by profit margins." Jim was silent for a long moment, processing the implications. Finally he spoke. "You're right, but you're also in over your head. Western mining has resources you can't match. They've got politicians in their pocket, judges too probably. So what do I do?" "You need leverage," Jim said thoughtfully. "And allies. People with enough influence to counter theirs." He examined a chunk of quartz shot through with gold. "May I take this?" "I know someone, a geologist who consults for the State Environmental Agency. Completely trustworthy. She could analyze the water, document its properties officially." Thomas hesitated, then agreed. The more official records, the better. As they prepared to leave the cave, Jim pointed to a reddish mineral deposit near the pool, different from the gold veins. "What's that?" Thomas shrugged. "Not sure. It's all through the rock around the pool. Might be what makes the water special." Jim carefully extracted a small sample. "Mind if we have this tested too?" Back at the house, they planned their next steps. Jim would contact his geologist friend first thing in the morning. Thomas would document everything about the cave and prepare for potential legal challenges. "One more thing," Jim said before leaving. "Your house, your truck. Assume they're being monitored. Say nothing important indoors or in your vehicle." Thomas nodded, the reality of his situation sinking in. What had begun as a desperate hope to save his ranch had become something far more complicated and dangerous. Thomas rose before dawn, his mind racing with plans and contingencies. The trespassers' advanced equipment had shaken him. Western mining was bringing substantial resources to bear, and time was running short. He made a quick trip to the cave, installing additional trail cameras and collecting more water samples. Back at the ranch, he carefully packaged gold specimens and documented the cave's location with photographs and measurements. Everything went into a waterproof container stored in a hollow beneath the barn floor, evidence that would survive even if his house was searched or destroyed. By mid-morning, a familiar truck was coming up his driveway. Diane Miller from the general store, an unexpected visitor. "Didn't expect to see you out this way," Thomas said as she stepped out of her vehicle. Diane's expression was troubled. "Thought you should know what's happening in town. Reed and his people are spreading rumors, saying you've gone senile, that you're illegally mining without permits, even that you're mistreating that old dog of yours." Thomas's jaw tightened. "Character assassination. Trying to discredit me before I can challenge them." "It's working on some folks," Diane admitted. "But others aren't buying it. Those of us who've known you for decades know better." She hesitated. "Thomas, there's more. Clayton's started foreclosure proceedings officially. Notices went up at the courthouse this morning." Thomas had expected this, but the news still hit hard. The bank was accelerating the timeline, undoubtedly pressured by Western mining. "How long?" he asked. 60 days. Half the normal period. Clayton's claiming special circumstances. Diane's expression softened. "I'm sorry, Thomas. It's not right. After Diane left, Thomas retrieved his property deed from the safe, examining it closely. The document represented 40 years of his life, his and Margaret's dreams made tangible. The thought of losing it to corporate greed burned in his chest. He was still studying the deed when Sheriff Harlan's patrol car appeared, followed by an unmarked sedan. Jim stepped out, accompanied by a woman in her 40s carrying scientific equipment. "Thomas, this is Dr. Helen Carter," Jim introduced her. "The geologist I mentioned. She's here unofficially, as a personal favor." Dr. Carter shook Thomas's hand firmly. Jim explained some of the situation. "I'm intrigued by what you found." They moved to the barn for privacy, where Thomas showed them his documentation and samples. Dr. Carter examined everything with professional interest, particularly the water samples and mineral specimens. "This is remarkable," she said, testing the pH and mineral content with portable equipment. "The combination of elements is extremely unusual. I've never seen this specific profile before." "Can you verify its properties officially?" Thomas asked. "I can document the composition," she replied carefully. "As for healing properties, that requires clinical studies, controlled trials. But I can confirm these minerals have known therapeutic applications in medical research." It wasn't everything Thomas had hoped for, but it was a start, scientific validation from a credible source. "There's something else you should see," Thomas said, leading them to where Lucky rested in the shade. "This dog was dying 3 weeks ago. Terminal cancer, according to the vet." Dr. Carter examined Lucky with gentle hands, noting her condition. "Remarkable recovery signs if what you say is true. The tumor regression alone would be significant." She looked at Thomas. "May I take blood samples? Compare them to her previous medical records?" Thomas agreed. More documentation meant more protection. As Dr. Carter worked, Jim pulled Thomas aside. "The trespassers were released this morning, as expected. Reed was waiting with attorneys and bail money." He lowered his voice. "But I served them with a restraining order before they left. They can't legally come within 500 yards of your property for the next 30 days. "That helps," Thomas acknowledged. "But doesn't solve the bigger problem." "No," Jim agreed. "But I've been thinking. This isn't just about your land anymore. It's potentially a public health resource. That changes the legal framework." Thomas considered this. "You're suggesting? If this water has the properties you claim, it could be designated a protected natural resource. That would prevent destructive mining operations, regardless of who owns the land." It was a promising angle, but Thomas knew it would take time to navigate the bureaucratic process, time he might not have with foreclosure looming. Dr. Carter joined them, packing up her samples. "I'll have preliminary results tomorrow. If they confirm what I suspect, you may have something truly unique here." She handed Thomas her card. "Call me directly with any developments. This discovery deserves proper scientific documentation." After they left, Thomas felt momentarily hopeful. Allies were emerging and with them, potential pathways to protecting the cave. But as he surveyed his property, the land he'd worked for 4 decades, he knew the battle was just beginning. The afternoon mail brought a formal foreclosure notice from Bridgeton Bank, the legal language cold and impersonal. Thomas had 60 days to pay the outstanding balance in full or vacate the property. The accelerated timeline was justified by a clause about property deterioration affecting collateral value, a transparent excuse. Thomas placed the notice alongside his deed on the kitchen table, the contrast between them stark. One represented his life's work, the other, the imminent threat of losing everything. Lucky nudged his hand with her nose, sensing his distress. Thomas scratched behind her ears, drawing strength from her remarkable recovery. "We're not done yet, girl," he told her softly. "Not by a long shot." Word spread quickly through Bridgeton. By the following evening, Thomas's phone hadn't stopped ringing. Neighbors, acquaintances, even people he barely knew, all calling to express concern about the rumors and the foreclosure notice. What surprised Thomas most was the support. Diane had organized an informal gathering at her store, where longtime residents shared stories of similar corporate tactics in other small towns, Promises of prosperity followed by environmental damage and abandoned communities once resources were depleted. Jim called with an update. Helen's preliminary tests confirmed the water contains a unique mineral profile with potential therapeutic applications. She's documented everything officially. He paused. There's more. The reddish mineral we found? It's an extremely rare earth element used in advanced medical technology. Worth far more than gold by weight. So that's what they're really after, Thomas said, the pieces falling into place. The gold is just a bonus. Exactly. And they destroy the healing spring to extract it. Thomas considered the implications. We need to make this public, not just about my land, but what's at stake for everyone. Agreed. There's a town council meeting tomorrow night. Perfect forum to bring this to light. After hanging up, Thomas sat on his porch with Lucky beside him, watching the sunset paint the hills with golden light. The land had never looked more precious to him than now, when he faced losing it. A vehicle approached, not the sleek SUV of Western mining, but Diane's old truck. She wasn't alone. 3 other trucks followed, carrying nearly a dozen townspeople Thomas had known for decades. Hope you don't mind the company, Diane said as they gathered on his front yard. Folks wanted to show support. Among them was Mrs. Peterson, whose porch Thomas had recently repaired, and Sam Wilson, a retired schoolteacher who'd taught both Thomas and Margaret decades ago. Even Pete from the mining supply store had come. Heard what's happening, Pete said gruffly. Ain't right what they're doing. Sam Wilson stepped forward. We've drafted a community petition against Western Mining's tactics and the bank's accelerated foreclosure. Everyone in town's signing it. He handed Thomas a document already bearing dozens of signatures. Thomas was momentarily speechless, overwhelmed by the show of support. We take care of our own here, Diane said simply. Always have. They stayed until dusk, helping Thomas repair fences and secure his property. Before leaving, they established a neighborhood watch rotation. Someone would be nearby at all times, observing and documenting any suspicious activity around Thomas's land. The next morning brought more developments. Dr. Carter called with news. I compared Lucky's blood work to her previous veterinary records, she said. The results are remarkable. Significant reduction in cancer markers, improved organ function, elevated immune response. From a scientific perspective, it's unprecedented for an animal her age with advanced disease. Can you document this officially? Thomas asked. Already have. I've also prepared a preliminary report on the water's composition for the Environmental Protection Registry. It creates a permanent scientific record that can't be easily dismissed. That evening, Thomas drove to the town hall, Lucky sitting proudly beside him in the truck. The council meeting room was packed beyond capacity, with people spilling out into the hallway. At the front sat Jason Reed and Clayton Reynolds, looking confident and prepared with stacks of documents and visual presentations. Thomas took a seat near the back, nodding to familiar faces. Jim Harlan stood against the wall in uniform, his presence both official and supportive. Mayor Wilson called the meeting to order. First agenda item, Western Mining Corporation's proposed operations in Bridgeton County. Mr. Reed, you have the floor. Reed approached the podium with practiced charm. Thank you, Mayor Wilson, council members, citizens of Bridgeton. Western Mining is excited to bring economic opportunity to your community. Our operations will create over 100 jobs and generate substantial tax revenue. His presentation was slick, filled with colorful charts showing economic benefits and minimal environmental impact. He specifically addressed Thomas's property, though not by name. We've identified significant mineral deposits in the eastern sector that could benefit the entire community. Unfortunately, one property owner has refused reasonable offers and instead engaged in unauthorized mining activities that threaten environmental safety. Murmurs ran through the crowd. Reed pressed on. We're simply asking the council to support responsible, professional resource development rather than unregulated, potentially dangerous amateur operations. When Reed finished, Mayor Wilson looked up. Thank you, Mr. Reed. Now, we have a request from Thomas Everett to address the council. Thomas walked slowly to the podium, Lucky following faithfully at his heels. He carried no charts or presentations, just a small vial of water and the community petition. "I'm not much for public speaking," he began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "But some things need to be said plain. I've lived on my ranch for 40 years. Never asked for handouts or special treatment." He placed the vial on the podium. "3 weeks ago, my dying dog led me to a discovery on my land, not just gold, though there's plenty of that, but something more valuable. Water with healing properties from minerals unique to that location." Reed scoffed audibly, but Thomas continued. "This dog was terminal with cancer. The vet has the records. Now look at her." Lucky sat alertly beside him, her improvement visible to all who knew her condition before. Scientific tests confirm what the water contains and what it can do. But Western mining doesn't care about that potential. They destroy it to extract minerals for profit. Thomas continued his address to the town council, his voice gaining strength as he spoke from the heart. Western mining isn't interested in Bridgeton's welfare. They're after quick profits, regardless of the cost to our community or the natural resources that might benefit everyone. He held up the vial of water. "This could help people, maybe lots of them. But once they blast that hillside apart, it's gone forever." He produced Dr. Carter's official report. Independent scientific analysis confirms the unique properties of this water. And the community petition I'm submitting shows that Bridgeton citizens don't want their town turned into another corporate mining casualty. Reed was on his feet immediately. "This is preposterous. Magical healing water? Mr. Everett is clearly suffering from delusions. His financial troubles are well documented. He's desperately trying to inflate the value of his worthless property." "That's enough, Mr. Reed," Mayor Wilson said firmly. "Dr. Helen Carter, I believe you're present? The council would appreciate your professional assessment." Dr. Carter approached the podium, her credentials impeccable and her manner authoritative. "The water sample from Mr. Everett's property contains a mineral profile I've never encountered in 30 years of geological research. Preliminary tests indicate potential therapeutic applications, particularly in treating inflammatory conditions." She presented her findings methodically, with the precision of a scientist accustomed to skepticism. While comprehensive clinical trials would be necessary to make definitive medical claims, the mineral composition alone makes this a site of significant scientific interest that warrants preservation and careful study. Clayton Reynolds spoke next, attempting to redirect the conversation to financial matters. "Whatever may or may not be on the property, the fact remains that Mr. Everett is in default on his loans. The bank has legal rights that must be respected." Sheriff Harlan stepped forward. "With respect, Mr. Reynolds, I've received troubling reports about the bank's handling of this matter. Accelerated foreclosure without proper cause, unusual coordination with Western Mining's acquisition timeline. These raise serious ethical and possibly legal questions." The meeting grew heated as citizens voiced their opinions. Many longtime residents spoke in Thomas's favor, while those hoping for mining jobs supported Western Mining. Mayor Wilson struggled to maintain order. Then, unexpectedly, Jason Reed received a call he felt compelled to take. As he stepped outside, Thomas noticed Reed's laptop remained open on the table. Acting on instinct, Thomas nodded to Diane, who accidentally spilled her water bottle near Reed's computer. In the confusion of cleaning up, Jim Harlan managed to insert a small USB drive into Reed's laptop, a drive containing software that would mirror the contents to Jim's phone. It was a risk, potentially illegal, but Thomas had agreed to Jim's plan out of desperation. When Reed returned, he seemed unusually confident. "Ladies and gentlemen, I think we're overcomplicating this matter. Western Mining has full legal authority to proceed with operations on all properties we've acquired. Mr. Everett's baseless claims won't stop progress." The council ultimately deferred any decision, establishing a committee to investigate further. It wasn't the outcome Thomas had hoped for, but it bought time. Outside the town hall, Reed approached Thomas directly. "Impressive performance, old man. But it changes nothing. We'll have your land one way or another." His smile was cold. "In fact, I received good news during that call. The State Mining Commission has fast-tracked our permits. We begin operations on adjacent properties next week. Thomas maintained his composure. We'll see about that. Back at the ranch, Thomas, Jim, and Dr. Carter reviewed what Jim had recovered from Reed's laptop: internal emails, geological surveys, and most damning of all, a comprehensive strategy document titled Acquisition Plan, Everett Property. They've been planning this for months, Jim said, scrolling through the files. They identified the rare earth deposits through aerial surveys last year. Dr. Carter pointed to a section of the geological report. They know about the spring too. Look, they've classified it as collateral damage necessary for extraction. The most disturbing discovery was evidence of illegal activities, bribes to county officials, fabricated environmental impact statements, and plans to discredit Thomas, including strategic rumors about his mental state. This is criminal, Jim said grimly. But it won't be easy to prove. Corporate lawyers will claim these documents are taken out of context or fabricated. We need more, Thomas agreed. Something they can't explain away. The opportunity came 3 nights later. Despite the restraining order, Thomas's trail cameras captured Reed and 2 men entering his property after midnight, heading directly toward the cave location. Thomas called Jim immediately. They're making their move, he said urgently. 3 of them with equipment. I'm 10 minutes out, Jim replied. Don't confront them alone. But Thomas knew 10 minutes might be too late. If they reached the cave, documented its contents, they might find a legal loophole to seize control. He grabbed his shotgun, not to threaten, but as a precaution, and with Lucky leading the way, headed into the darkness. Thomas reached the cave entrance just as Reed and his men were setting up equipment to remove the concealed covering. Using his knowledge of the terrain, Thomas circled to a position above them, where he could observe without being seen. Reed was speaking to the others. Once we document the deposit, our lawyers can file an emergency injunction claiming Everett has been concealing a public resource. The restraining order becomes moot. Thomas activated the video function on his phone, capturing Reed's instructions to trespass and their sophisticated equipment, clear violations of both the restraining order and numerous laws. The men had just begun to expose the cave entrance when Sheriff Harlan's voice cut through the darkness. Freeze! Sheriff's Department. Jim emerged from the trees, his deputy close behind, weapons drawn. Jason Reed, you're in violation of a restraining order and trespassing on private property. Reed's shock quickly turned to arrogance. This is a misunderstanding, Sheriff. We received reports of environmental hazards that required immediate investigation. At midnight? With no warrants or permits. Jim gestured to his deputy to secure the other men. We have you on video discussing your actual intentions, Mr. Reed. This time, there won't be a quick release. 6 months later, Thomas sat on his front porch, watching the morning sun illuminate the eastern hills. Lucky dozed at his feet, her coat glossy despite her advanced age, her breathing deep and even. They had both come a long way since that autumn day when she had led him to the cave. The land around the ranch had transformed. A small, tasteful research facility now stood at the base of the eastern slope, its architecture designed to blend with the natural landscape. The Winters Spring Research Center, named in honor of the old prospector who had first discovered the cave, housed a team of scientists studying the unique mineral properties of the water. Thomas's legal victory had been comprehensive. Reed's arrest for trespassing had been just the beginning. The evidence recovered from his laptop, combined with the video of his illegal activities, had triggered investigations into Western mining's practices across multiple states. The corporation now faced federal charges for environmental violations, bribery, and fraud. Clayton Reynolds had resigned in disgrace when his collusion with Western Mining came to light. The new bank manager had been quick to offer Thomas revised loan terms, which Thomas had accepted, but only after ensuring his property's special status was legally protected. The arrangement Thomas had negotiated was unique. He maintained ownership of the land and controlled access to the cave, but had granted limited research rights to a coalition of medical research institutions. The spring water was being studied for its therapeutic applications, with promising early results in treating certain inflammatory conditions and supporting immune function. A portion of any eventual medical applications would provide Thomas with financial security, but more importantly, the agreement ensured the site would be preserved, not exploited. No blasting, no industrial extraction, just careful, sustainable collection of the water and scientific documentation of its properties. Diane's truck appeared on the driveway, followed by Jim Harlan's personal vehicle. They had become regular visitors since the confrontation with Western Mining. "Morning, Thomas," Diane called, carrying a basket of fresh baked goods. At 64, she had recently sold her store to her nephew but remained active in community affairs. "Thought you might want these for your meeting today." Jim approached more slowly, his limp more pronounced in the cool morning air, a souvenir from his army days that the spring water had helped but not entirely healed. "University folks arrived yet?" "Expected at noon," Thomas replied, pouring coffee for his friends. "They're bringing some new research findings they wanted to discuss in person." The three settled into a comfortable silence, watching Lucky chase a butterfly across the yard with the energy of a much younger dog. The spring water had worked wonders, though Dr. Carter cautioned it wasn't a cure-all. Lucky was still an old dog, but one with a quality of life no one had thought possible 6 months ago. "Hard to believe how much has changed," Jim said, nodding toward the research center visible in the distance. "You could have taken their money and retired somewhere warm." "Most would have." Thomas shook his head. This land was never just about money. Margaret knew that. He glanced toward the small rise where his wife was buried, now surrounded by a garden of wildflowers. "She always said there was treasure in these hills. Just took an old dog to show me where to look." As if hearing her name, Lucky returned to the porch, settling at Thomas's feet with a contented sigh. Diane smiled. "Speaking of changes, Thomas, you haven't mentioned the letter from your daughter." Thomas had reconnected with his estranged daughter after the news coverage of his stand against Western Mining. 30 years of silence had ended with a tentative phone call, followed by letters and eventually a visit. Their relationship was still healing, but like the spring water, time and patience were working their magic. "She's thinking of moving back to the area," Thomas said, a smile softening his weathered face. "Says her kids should know their grandfather." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a small bus bearing the university logo. Scientists and researchers filed out, greeting Thomas with the respect due to both property owner and partner. Dr. Carter led the group, carrying folders of data and beaming with excitement. "The latest trials exceeded expectations, Thomas. The water's effects on cellular regeneration are remarkable. We're documenting results that could change treatment protocols for numerous conditions." As Thomas led the group toward the research center, Lucky trotted alongside, her role as co-discoverer acknowledged by all. The old dog that nobody had wanted had become something of a celebrity in scientific circles, living proof of the water's effects. Later that evening, after the visitors had departed, Thomas sat in Margaret's rocking chair, now positioned beside his own on the porch. Lucky climbed the steps slowly but steadily, settling between the two chairs as she did every evening. Thomas reached down to scratch behind her ears, his fingers finding the worn leather collar he'd kept all these months. "You knew all along, didn't you, girl? Jack Winters trained you to find that cave, to lead the right person there when the time came." Lucky's tail thumped against the porch boards, once, twice, 3 times. The sun sank behind the western ridge, painting the sky in brilliant orange and gold. But Thomas's gaze remained fixed on the eastern hills, where an old dog's determination had led to an unexpected treasure, not just gold or healing water, but renewed purpose and connection. Margaret had been right after all. The land did give back what you put into it. Sometimes it just took an unlikely guide to show the way.